The fifth day, Tuesday, 7 December. Moscow. It was not the grandest office in the Kremlin, but it suited his needs. Admiral Yuri Ilyich Fedorin showed up for work at his customary 7 o'clock after the drive from his six-room apartment in the Kutuzovsky Prospect. The large office windows overlooked the Kremlin walls. Except for those, he would have had a view of the Moscow River, now frozen solid. Fedorin did not miss the view, though he had won his spurs commanding river gunboats 40 years before, running supplies across the Volga into Stalingrad. Fedorin was now the chief political officer of the Soviet Navy. His job was men, not ships. On the way in, he nodded curtly to his secretary, a man of 40. The yeoman leaped to his feet and followed his admiral into the inner office to help him off with his greatcoat. Fedorin's navy blue jacket was ablaze with ribbons and the Gold Star Medal of the most coveted award in the Soviet military, Hero of the Soviet Union. He had won that in combat as a freckled boy of 20, shuttling back and forth on the Volga. Those were good days, he told himself, dodging bombs from the German Stukas and the more random artillery fire with which the fascists had tried to interdict his squadron. Like most men, he was unable to remember the stark terror of combat. It was a Tuesday morning, and Fedorin had a pile of mail waiting on his desk. His yeoman got him a pot of tea and a cup, the usual Russian glass cup set in a metal holder, sterling silver in this case. Fedorin had worked long and hard for the perks that came with this office. He settled in his chair and read first through the intelligence dispatches, information copies of data sent each morning and evening to the operational commands of the Soviet Navy. A political officer had to keep current, to know what the imperialists were up to so that he could brief his men on the threat. Next came the official mail from within the People's Commissariat of the Navy and the Ministry of Defense. He had access to all of the correspondence from the former, while that from the latter had been carefully vetted since the Soviet armed services share as little information as possible. There wasn't too much mail from either place today. The usual Monday afternoon meeting had covered most of what had to be done that week, and nearly everything Fedorin was concerned with was now in the hands of his staff for disposition. He poured a second cup of tea and opened a new pack of unfiltered cigarettes, a habit he'd been unable to break despite a mild heart attack 3 years earlier. He checked his desk calendar. Good. No appointments until 10. Near the bottom of the pile was an official-looking envelope from the Northern Fleet. The code number at the upper left corner showed that it came from the Red October. Hadn't he just read something about that? Fedorin rechecked his ops dispatches. So, Ramius hadn't turned up in his exercise area. He shrugged. Missile submarines were supposed to be elusive, and it would not have surprised the old admiral at all if Ramius were twisting a few tails. The son of Alexander Ramius was a prima donna who had the troubling habit of seeming to build his own personality cult. He kept some of the men he trained and discarded others. Fedorin reflected that those rejected for line service had made excellent Zampoliti, and appeared to have more line knowledge than was the norm. Even so, Ramius was a captain who needed watching. Sometimes Fedorin suspected that he was too much a sailor and not enough a communist. On the other hand, his father had been a model party member and a hero of the Great Patriotic War. Certainly he had been well thought of, Lithuanian or not. And the son. Years of letter-perfect performance, as many years of stalwart party membership. He was known for his spirited participation at meetings and occasionally brilliant essays. The people in the naval branch of the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, reported that the imperialists regarded him as a dangerous and skilled enemy. Good, Fedorin thought. The bastards ought to fear our men. He turned his attention back to the envelope. Red October. Now there was a fitting name for a Soviet warship, named not only for the revolution that had forever changed the history of the world, but also for the Red October tractor plant. Many was the dawn when Fedorin had looked west to Stalingrad to see if the factory still stood, a symbol to the Soviet fighting men struggling against the Hitlerite bandits. The envelope was marked confidential, and his yeoman had not opened it as he had the other routine mail. The admiral took his letter opener from the desk drawer. It was a sentimental object, having been his service knife years before. When his first gunboat had been sunk under him, one hot August night in 1942, he had swum to shore and been pounced on by a German infantryman who hadn't expected resistance from a half-drowned sailor. Fedorin had surprised him, sinking the knife in his chest and breaking off half the blade as he stole his enemy's life. Later, a machinist had trimmed the blade down. It was no longer a proper knife, but Fedorin wasn't about to throw this sort of souvenir away. Comrade Admiral, the letter began, but the type had been scratched out and replaced with a handwritten Uncle Yuri. Ramius had jokingly called him that years back when Padoran was chief political officer of the Northern Fleet. Thank you for your confidence and for the opportunity you have given me with command of this magnificent ship. Ramius ought to be grateful, Padoran thought. Performance or not, you don't give this sort of command to— What? Padoran stopped reading and started over. He forgot the cigarette smoldering in his ashtray as he reached the bottom of the first page. A joke. Ramius was known for his jokes, but he'd pay for this one. This was going too fucking far. He turned the page. This is no joke, Uncle Yuri. Marco. Padoran stopped and looked out the window. The Kremlin wall at this point was a beehive of niches for the ashes of the party faithful. He couldn't have read the letter correctly. He started to read it again. His hands began to shake. He had a direct line to Admiral Gorshkov with no yeomen or secretaries to bar the way. Comrade Admiral, this is Padoran.
Good morning, Yuri,
Gorshkov said pleasantly.
I must see you immediately. I have a situation here. What sort of situation?
Gorshkov asked warily.
We must discuss it in person. I am coming over now.
There was no way he'd discuss this over the phone. He knew it was tapped. The USS Dallas. Sonar Man Second Class Ronald Jones, his division officer noted, was in his usual trance. The young college dropout was hunched over his instrument table, body limp, eyes closed, face locked into the same neutral expression he wore when listening to one of the many Bach tapes on his expensive personal cassette player. Jones was the sort who categorized his tapes by their flaws: a ragged piano tempo, a botched flute, a wavering French horn. He listened to sea sounds with the same discriminating intensity. In all the navies of the world, submariners were regarded as a curious breed, and submariners themselves looked upon sonar operators as odd. Their eccentricities, however, were among the most tolerated in the military service. The executive officer liked to tell a story about a sonar chief he'd served with for 2 years, a man who had patrolled the same areas in missile submarines for virtually his whole career. He became so familiar with the humpback whales that summered in the area that he took to calling them by name. On retiring, he went to work for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, where his talent was regarded not so much with amusement as awe. 3 years earlier, Jones had been asked to leave the California Institute of Technology in the middle of his junior year. He had pulled one of the ingenious pranks for which Caltech students were justly famous, only it hadn't worked. Now he was serving his time in the Navy to finance his return. It was his announced intention to get a doctorate in cybernetics and signal processing. In return for an early out, after receiving his degree, he would go to work for the Naval Research Laboratory. Lieutenant Thompson believed it. On joining the Dallas 6 months earlier, he had read the files of all his men. Jones's IQ was 158, the highest on the boat by a fair margin. He had a placid face and sad brown eyes that women found irresistible. On the beach, Jones had enough action to wear down a squad of Marines. It didn't make much sense to the lieutenant. He'd been the football hero at Annapolis. Jones was a skinny kid who listened to Bach. It didn't figure. The USS Dallas, a 688 class attack submarine, was 40 miles from the coast of Iceland, approaching her patrol station, codenamed Toll Booth. She was 2 days late getting there. A week earlier, she had participated in the NATO war game Nifty Dolphin, which had been postponed several days because the worst North Atlantic weather in 20 years had delayed other ships detailed to it. In that exercise, the Dallas, teamed with HMS Swiftsure, had used the foul weather to penetrate and ravage the simulated enemy formation. It was yet another 4-0 performance for the Dallas and her skipper, Commander Bart Mancuso, one of the youngest submarine commanders in the U.S. Navy. The mission had been followed by a courtesy call at a Swiftsures Royal Navy base in Scotland, and the American sailors were still shaking off hangovers from the celebration. Now they had a different mission, a new development in the Atlantic submarine game. For 3 weeks, the Dallas was to report on traffic in and out of Red Route 1. Over the past 14 months, newer Soviet submarines had been using a strange, effective tactic for shedding their American and British shadowers. Southwest of Iceland, the Russian boats would race down the Reykjanes Ridge, a finger of underwater highlands pointing to the deep Atlantic basin. Spaced at intervals from 5 miles to half a mile, these mountains, with their knife-edged ridges of brittle igneous rock, rivaled the Alps in size. Their peaks were about 1,000 feet beneath the stormy surface of the North Atlantic. Before the late 60s, submarines could barely approach the peaks, much less probe their myriad valleys. Throughout the 70s, Soviet naval survey vessels had been seen patrolling the ridge in all seasons, in all weather, quartering and re-quartering the area in thousands of cruises. Then, 14 months before the Dallas's present patrol, the USS Los Angeles had been tracking a Soviet Victor II-class attack submarine. The Victor had skirted the Icelandic coast and gone deep as she approached the ridge. The Los Angeles had followed. The Victor proceeded at 8 knots until she passed between the first pair of seamounts, informally known as Thor's twins. All at once she went to full speed and moved southwest. The skipper of the Los Angeles made a determined effort to track the Victor and came away from it badly shaken. Although the 688-class submarines were faster than the older Victors, the Russian submarine had simply not slowed down for 15 hours, it was later determined. At first it had not been all that dangerous. Submarines had highly accurate inertial navigation systems able to fix their positions to within a few hundred yards from one second to another. But the Victor was skirting cliffs as though her skipper could see them, like a fighter dodging down a canyon to avoid surface-to-air missile fire. The Los Angeles could not keep track of the cliffs. At any speed over 20 knots, both her passive and active sonar, including the echophathometer, became almost useless. The Los Angeles thus found herself navigating completely blind. It was, the skipper later reported, like driving a car with the windows painted over, steering with a map and a stopwatch. This was theoretically possible, but the captain quickly realized that the inertial navigation system had a built-in error factor of several hundred yards. This was aggravated by gravitational disturbances, which affected the local vertical, which in turn affected the inertial fix. Worst of all, his charts were made for surface ships. Objects below a few hundred feet had been known to be misplaced by miles, something that mattered to no one until recently. The interval between mountains had quickly become less than his cumulative navigational error. Sooner or later his submarine would drive into a mountainside at over 30 knots. The captain backed off. The Victor got away. Initially it was theorized that the Soviets had somehow staked out one particular route, that their submarines were able to follow it at high speed. Russian skippers were known to pull some crazy stunts, and perhaps they were trusting to a combination of inertial systems, magnetic and gyro compasses attuned to a specific track. This theory had never developed much of a following, and in a few weeks it was known for certain that the Soviet submarines speeding through the ridge were following a multiplicity of tracks. The only thing American and British subs could do was stop periodically to get a sonar fix of their positions, then race to catch up. But the Soviet subs never slowed, and the 688s and the Trafalgars kept falling behind. The Dallas was on Tollbooth Station to monitor passing Russian subs, to watch the entrance to the passage the U.S. Navy was now calling Red Route 1, and to listen for any external evidence of a new gadget that might enable the Soviets to run the ridge so boldly. Until the Americans could copy it, there were three unsavory alternatives. They could continue losing contact with the Russians, they could station valuable attack subs at the known exits from the route, or they could set up a whole new SOSUS line. Jones's trance lasted 10 minutes, longer than usual. He ordinarily had a contact figured out in far less time. The sailor leaned back and lit a cigarette. "Got something, Mr. Thompson?" "What is it?" Thompson leaned against the bulkhead. "I don't know." Jones picked up a spare set of phones and handed them to his officer. "Listen up, sir." Thompson himself was a master's candidate in electrical engineering, an expert in sonar system design. His eyes screwed shut as he concentrated on the sound. It was a very faint, low-frequency rumble or swish. He couldn't decide. He listened for several minutes before setting the headphones down, then shook his head. "I got it a half-hour ago on the lateral array," Jones said. He referred to a subsystem of the BQQ-5 multifunction submarine sonar. Its main component was an 18-foot diameter dome located in the bow. The dome was used for both active and passive operations. A new part of the system was a gang of passive sensors which extended 200 feet down both sides of the hull. This was a mechanical analog to the sensory organs on the body of a shark. "Lost it, got it back, lost it, got it back," Jones went on. "It's not screw sounds, not whales or fish. More like water going through a pipe, except for that funny rumble that comes and goes. Anyway, the bearing is about 250. That puts it between us and Iceland, so it can't be too far away." "Let's see what it looks like. Maybe that'll tell us something." Jones took a double-plugged wire from a hook. One plug went into a socket on his sonar panel, the other into the jack on a nearby oscilloscope. The two men spent several minutes working with the sonar controls to isolate the signal. They ended up with an irregular sine wave which they were only able to hold a few seconds at a time.
"Irregular,"
Thompson said. "Yeah, it's funny. It sounds regular, but it doesn't look regular. Know what I mean, Mr. Thompson?"
"No. You've got better ears."
"That's because I listen to better music, sir. That rock stuff will kill your ears." Thompson knew he was right, but an Annapolis graduate doesn't need to hear that from an enlisted man. His vintage Janis Joplin tapes were his own business.
"Next step."
"Yes, sir." Jones took the plug from the oscilloscope and moved it into a panel to the left of the sonar board next to a computer terminal. During her last overhaul, the Dallas had received a very special toy to go along with her BQQ-5 sonar system, called the BC-10. It was the most powerful computer yet installed aboard a submarine. Though only about the size of a business desk, it cost over $5 million and ran at 80 million operations per second. It used newly developed 64-bit chips and made use of the latest processing architecture. Its bubble memory could easily accommodate the computing needs of a whole squadron of submarines. In 5 years, every attack sub in the fleet would have one. Its purpose, much like that of the far larger SOSUS system, was to process and analyze sonar signals. The BC-10 stripped away ambient noise and other naturally produced sea sounds to classify and identify man-made noise. It could identify ships by name from their individual acoustical signatures, much as one could identify the finger or voice prints of a human. As important as the computer was its programming software. 4 years before, a Ph.D. candidate in geophysics who was working at Caltech's Geophysical Laboratory had completed a program of 600,000 steps designed to predict earthquakes. The problem the program addressed was one of signal versus noise. It overcame the difficulty seismologists had discriminating between random noise that is constantly monitored on seismographs and genuinely unusual signals that foretell a seismic event. The first Defense Department use of the program was in the Air Force Technical Applications Command, AFTAC, which found it entirely satisfactory for its mission of monitoring nuclear events throughout the world in accordance with arms control treaties. The Navy Research Laboratory also redrafted it for its own purposes. Though inadequate for seismic predictions, it worked very well indeed in analyzing sonar signals. The program was known in the Navy as the Signal Algorithmic Processing System, SAPS. SAPS signal input, Jones typed into the video display terminal, VDT. "Ready," the BC-10 responded at once. "Run." "Working." For all the fantastic speed of the BC-10, the 600,000 steps of the program, punctuated by numerous go-to loops, took time to run as the machine eliminated natural sounds with its random profile criteria and then locked into the anomalous signal. It took 20 seconds, an eternity in computer time. The answer came up on the VDT. Jones pressed a key to generate a copy on the adjacent matrix printer. "Humph!" Jones tore off the page. "Anomalous signal evaluated as magma displacement. That's SAP's way of saying, take 2 aspirin and call me at the end of the watch." Thompson chuckled. For all the ballyhoo that had accompanied the new system, it was not all that popular in the fleet. "Remember what the papers said when we were in England? Something about seismic activity around Iceland? Like when that island poked up back in the 60s? Jones lit another cigarette. He knew the student who had originally drafted this abortion they called SAPS. One problem was that it had a nasty habit of analyzing the wrong signal, and you couldn't tell it was wrong from the result. Besides, since it had been originally designed to look for seismic events, Jones suspected it of a tendency to interpret anomalies as seismic events. He didn't like the built-in bias which he felt the research laboratory had not entirely removed. It was one thing to use computers as a tool, quite another to let them do your thinking for you. Besides, they were always discovering new sea sounds that nobody had ever heard before, much less classified. "Sir, the frequency is all wrong, for one thing, nowhere near low enough. How about I try and track in on this signal with the R-15? Jones referred to the towed array of passive sensors that the Dallas was trailing behind her at low speed. Commander Mancuso came in just then, the usual mug of coffee in his hand. If there was one frightening thing about the captain, Thompson thought, it was his talent for showing up when something was going on. Did he have the whole boat wired? "Just wandering by," he said casually. "What's happening this fine day?" The captain leaned against the bulkhead. He was a small man, only 5'8", who had fought a battle against his waistline all his life and was now losing because of the good food and lack of exercise on a submarine. His dark eyes were surrounded by laugh lines that were always deeper when he was playing a trick on another ship. Was it day? Thompson wondered. The 6-hour, 1-in-3 rotating watch cycle made for a convenient work schedule, but after a few changes you had to press the button on your watch to figure out what day it was, else you couldn't make the proper entry in the log. "Skipper, Jones picked up a funny signal on the lateral. The computer says it's magma displacement." "And Jonesy doesn't agree with that." Mancuso didn't have to make it a question. "No, sir, Captain, I don't. I don't know what it is, but for sure it ain't that." "You against the machine again?" "Skipper, SAPS works pretty well most of the time, but sometimes it's a real kludge." Jones's epithet was the most pejorative curse of electronics people. "For one thing, the frequency is all wrong." "Okay, what do you think?" "I don't know, Captain. It isn't screw sounds, and it isn't any naturally produced sound that I've heard. Beyond that—" Jones was struck by the informality of the discussion with his commanding officer, even after 3 years on nuclear subs. The crew of the Dallas was like one big family, albeit one of the old frontier families, since everybody worked pretty damned hard. The captain was the father. The executive officer, everyone would readily agree, was the mother. The officers were the older kids, and the enlisted men were the younger kids. The important thing was, if you had something to say, the captain would listen to you. To Jones, this counted for a lot. Mancuso nodded thoughtfully. "Well, keep at it. No sense letting all this expensive gear go to waste." Jones grinned. Once he had told the captain in precise detail how he could convert this equipment into the world's finest stereo rig. Mancuso had pointed out that it would not be a major feat since the sonar gear in this room alone cost over $20 million. "Christ!" The junior technician bolted upright in his chair. "Somebody just stomped on the gas!" Jones was the sonar watch supervisor. The other 2 watchstanders noted the new signal, and Jones switched his phones to the towed array jack while the 2 officers kept out of the way. He took a scratch pad and noted the time before working on his individual controls. The BQR-15 was the most sensitive sonar rig on the boat, but its sensitivity was not needed for this contact. "Damn!" Jones muttered quietly. "Charlie," said the junior technician. Jones shook his head. "Victor. Victor class for sure. Doing turns for 30 knots, big burst of cavitation noise. He's digging big holes in the water and he doesn't care who knows it. Bearing 050. Skipper, we got good water around us and the signal is real faint. He's not close." It was the closest thing to a range estimate Jones could come up with. Not close meant anything over 10 miles. He went back to working his controls. "I think we know this guy. This is the one with a bent blade on his screw. Sounds like he's got a chain wrapped around it." "Put it on speaker," Mancuso told Thompson. He didn't want to disturb the operators. The lieutenant was already keying the signal into the BC-10. The bulkhead-mounted speaker would have commanded a 4-figure price in any stereo shop for its clarity and dynamic perfection. Like everything else on the 688 class sub, it was the very best that money could buy. As Jones worked on the sound controls, they heard the whining chirp of propeller cavitation, the thin screech associated with a bent propeller blade, and the deeper rumble of a Victor's reactor plant at full power. The next thing Mancuso heard was a printer. "Victor 1 class, number 6, Thompson announced. "Right," Jones nodded. "Vic 6, bearing still 050. He plugged the mouthpiece into his headphones. "Con, sonar. We have a contact. A Victor class, bearing 050, estimated target speed 30 knots. Mancuso leaned out into the passageway to address Lieutenant Pat Mannion, officer of the deck. "Pat, man the fire control tracking party." "Aye, Captain." "Wait a minute." Jones' hand went up. "Got another one." He twiddled some knobs. "This one's a Charlie class. Damned if he ain't digging holes, too. More easterly, bearing 073, doing turns for about 28 knots. We know this guy, too." "Yeah, Charlie 2, number 11. Jones slipped the phone off one ear and looked at Mancuso. "Skipper, the Ruskies have sub-races scheduled for today?" "Not that they told me about. Of course, we don't get the sports page out here." Mancuso chuckled, swirling the coffee around in his cup and hiding his real thoughts. What the hell was going on? "I suppose I'll go forward and take a look at this. Good work, guys." He went a few steps forward into the attack center. The normal steaming watch was set. Mannion had the con, with a junior officer of the deck and 7 enlisted men. A first-class fire controlman was entering data from the target motion analyzer into the Mark 117 fire control computer. Another officer was entering control to take charge of the tracking exercise. There was nothing unusual about this. The whole watch went about its work alertly, but with a relaxed demeanor that came with years of training and experience. While the other armed services routinely had their components run exercises against allies or themselves in emulation of Eastern Bloc tactics, the Navy had its attack submarines play their games against the real thing, and constantly. Submariners typically operated on what was effectively an at-war footing. "So, we have company," Mannion observed. "Not that close," Lieutenant Charles Goodman noted. "These bearings haven't changed a whisker."
"Con, sonar."
It was Jones's voice. Mancuso took it. "Con I, what is it, Jonesy?"
"We got another one, sir. Alpha 3, bearing 055, running flat out. Sounds like an earthquake, but faint, sir."
"Alpha 3? Our old friend Politovsky. Haven't run across her in a while. Anything else you can tell me?"
"I guess, sir. The sound on this one warbled, then settled down, like she was making a turn. I think she's heading this way. That's a little shaky. And we have some more noise to the northeast. Too confused to make any sense of just now. We're working on it."
"Okay. Nice work, Jonesy. Keep at it."
"Sure thing, Captain."
Mancuso smiled as he set the phone down, looking over at Mannion. "You know, Pat, sometimes I wonder if Jonesy isn't part witch." Mannion looked at the paper tracks that Goodman was drawing to back up the computerized targeting process. "He's pretty good. Problem is, he thinks we work for him." "Right now, we are working for him." Jones was their eyes and ears, and Mancuso was damned glad to have him. "Chuck?" Mancuso asked Lieutenant Goodman. "Bearing still constant on all 3 contacts, sir," which probably meant they were heading for the Dallas. It also meant they could not develop the range data necessary for a fire control solution. Not that anyone wanted to shoot, but this was the point of the exercise. "Pat, let's get some sea room. Move us about 10 miles east," Mancuso ordered casually. There were 2 reasons for this. First, it would establish a baseline from which to compute probable target range. Second, the deeper water would make for better acoustical conditions, opening up to them the distant sonar convergence zones. The captain studied the chart as his navigator gave the necessary orders, evaluating the tactical situation. Bartolomeo Mancuso was the son of a barber who closed his shop in Cicero, Illinois, every fall to hunt deer in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Bart had accompanied his father on these hunts, shot his first deer at the age of 12, and every year thereafter until entering the Naval Academy. He had never bothered after that. Since becoming an officer on nuclear submarines, he had learned a much more diverting game. Now he hunted people. 2 hours later, an alarm bell went off on the ELF radio in the sub's communications room. Like all nuclear submarines, the Dallas was trailing a lengthy wire antenna attuned to the extremely low-frequency transmitter in the central United States. The channel had a frustratingly narrow data bandwidth. Unlike a TV channel, which transmitted thousands of bits of data per frame, 30 frames per second, the ELF radio passed on data slowly, about 1 character every 30 seconds. The duty radio man waited patiently while the information was recorded on tape. When the message was finished, he ran the tape at high speed and transcribed the message, handing it to the communications officer who was waiting with his codebook. The signal was actually not a code, but a one-time pad cipher. A book, published every 6 months and distributed to every nuclear submarine, was filled with randomly generated transpositions for each letter of the signal. Each scrambled 3-letter group in this book corresponded to a pre-selected word or phrase in another book. Deciphering the message by hand took under 3 minutes, and when that was completed, it was carried to the captain in the attack center. NHG, from Com Sub Lant. JPR, to Lant Subs at Sea. YTR, stand by. OPY, possible. TBD, major. QEQ, redeployment order. GER, large scale. MAL, unexpected. ASF, Red Fleet operation. NME, in progress. TYQ, nature unknown. ORV, next ELF message. HWZ, communicate S6. Com Sub Lant, commander of the submarine force in the Atlantic, was Mancuso's big boss, Vice Admiral Vincent Gallery. The old man was evidently contemplating a reshuffling of his entire force, no minor affair. The next wake-up signal, AAA encrypted of course, would alert them to go to periscope antenna depth to get more detailed instructions from S6, the Submarine Satellite Information Exchange, a geosynchronous communication satellite used exclusively by submarines. The tactical situation was becoming clearer, though its strategic implications were beyond his ability to judge. The 10-mile move eastward had given them adequate range information for their initial 3 contacts, and another Alpha which had turned up a few minutes later. The first of the contacts, Vic-6, was now within torpedo range. A Mark 48 was locked in on her, and there was no way that her skipper could know the Dallas was here. Vic-6 was a deer in his sights, but it wasn't hunting season. Though not much faster than the Victors and Charlies, and 10 knots slower than the smaller Alphas, the Dallas and her sisters could move almost silently at nearly 20 knots. This was a triumph of engineering and design, the product of decades of work. But moving without being detected was useful only if the hunter could at the same time detect his quarry. Sonars lost effectiveness as their carrier platform increased speed. The Dallas's BQQ-5 retained 20% effectiveness at 20 knots, nothing to cheer about. Submarines running at high speed from one point to another were blind and unable to harm anyone. As a result, the operating pattern of an attack submarine was much like that of a combat infantryman. With a rifleman, it was called dash and cover. With a sub, sprint and drift. After detecting a target, a sub would race to a more advantageous position, stop to reacquire her prey, then dash again until a firing position had been achieved. The sub's quarry would be moving too, and if the submarine could gain position in front of it, she had then only to lie in wait like a great hunting cat to strike. The submariner's trade required more than skill. It required instinct and an artist's touch, monomaniacal confidence, and the aggressiveness of a professional boxer. Mancuso had all of these things. He had spent 15 years learning his craft, watching a generation of commanders as a junior officer, listening carefully at the frequent round-table discussions which made submarining a very human profession, its lessons passed on by verbal tradition. Time on shore had been spent training in a variety of computerized simulators, attending seminars, comparing notes and ideas with his peers. Aboard surface ships and ASW aircraft, he learned how the enemy, the surface sailors, played his own hunting game. Submariners lived by a simple motto. There are 2 kinds of ships, submarines and targets. What would Dallas be hunting? Mancuso wondered. Russian subs? Well, if that was the game and the Russians kept racing around like this, it ought to be easy enough. He and the Swiftsure had just bested a team of NATO ASW experts, men whose countries depended on their ability to keep the sea lanes open. His boat and his crew were performing as well as any man could ask. In Jones, he had one of the 10 best sonar operators in the fleet. Mancuso was ready, whatever the game might be. As on the opening day of hunting season, outside considerations were dwindling away. He was becoming a weapon. CIA headquarters. It was 4:45 in the morning, and Ryan was dozing fitfully in the back of a CIA Chevy, taking him from the Marriott to Langley. He'd been over for, 20 hours? About that. Enough time to see his boss, see Skip, get the presents for Sally, and check the house. The house looked to be in good shape. He had rented it to an instructor at the Naval Academy. He could have gotten 5 times the rent from someone else, but he didn't want any wild parties in his home. The officer was a Bible thumper from Kansas and made an acceptable custodian. 5.5 hours of sleep in the past 30? Something like that. He was too tired to look at his watch. It wasn't fair. Sleeplessness murders judgment, but it made little sense telling himself that, and telling the Admiral would make less. He was in Greer's office 5 minutes later. "Sorry to have to wake you up, Jack." "Oh, that's all right, sir." Ryan returned the lie. "What's up?"
"Come on over and grab some coffee. It's going to be a long day."
Ryan dropped his topcoat on the sofa and walked over to pour a mug of navy brew. He decided against coffee made of sugar, better to endure it naked and get the caffeine full force. "Any place I can shave around here, sir?"
"Head's behind the door over in the corner."
Greer handed him a yellow sheet torn from a telex machine.
"Look at this."
Top secret. 102200 Zulu, 38976. NSA SIGINT Bulletin. Red Nave Ops. Message follows. At 083145 Zulu, NSA monitor stations, deleted, and deleted, recorded an ELF broadcast from Red Fleet ELF facility, Semipolopinsk. Message duration 10 minutes. 6 elements. ELF signal is evaluated as prep broadcast to Red Fleet submarines at sea. At 090000 Zulu, an all-ships broadcast was made by Red Fleet Headquarters, Central Como Station Tula, and Satellites 3 and 5. Bands used: HF, VHF, UHF. Message duration 39 seconds with 2 repeats identical content, made at 091000 Zulu and 092000 Zulu. 475 5-element cipher groups. Signal coverage as follows: Northern Fleet Area, Baltic Fleet Area, and Med Squadron Area. Note: Far East Fleet not, repeat, not affected by this broadcast. Numerous acknowledgement signals emanated from addresses in areas cited above. Origin and traffic analysis to follow. Not completed at this time. Beginning at 100000 Zulu, NSA monitor stations, deleted, and deleted, recorded increased HF and VHF traffic at Red Fleet bases Polyarny, Severomorsk, Pechenga, Tallinn, Kronstadt, and Eastern Med area. Additional HF and VHF traffic from Red Fleet assets at sea. Amplification to follow. Evaluation. A major unplanned Red Fleet operation has been ordered, with fleet assets reporting availability and status. End bulletin. NSA sends. 102215 Zulu, break. Ryan looked at his watch. Fast work by the boys at NSA, and fast work by our duty watch officers getting everybody up. He drained his mug and went over for a refill. What's the word on signal traffic analysis?
Here.
Greer handed him a second telex sheet. Ryan scanned it. That's a lot of ships. Must be nearly everything they have at sea. Not much on the ones in port, though.
Landline, Greer observed. The ones in port can phone fleet ops, Moscow. By the way, that is every ship they have at sea in the Western Hemisphere. Every damned one. Any ideas?
Let's see. We have that increased activity in the Barents Sea. Looks like a medium-sized ASW exercise. Maybe they're expanding it. Doesn't explain the increased activity in the Baltic and Med, though. Do they have a war game laid on?
Nope. They just finished Crimson Storm a month ago.
Ryan nodded. Yeah, they usually take a couple of months to evaluate that much data. And who'd want to play games up there at this time of the year? The weather's supposed to be a bitch. Have they ever run a major game in December?
Not a big one. But most of these acknowledgments are from submarines, son, and subs don't care a whole lot about the weather.
Well, given some other preconditions, you might call this ominous. No idea what the signal said, eh?
No. They're using computer-based ciphers, same as us. If the spooks at the NSA can read them, they're not telling me about it.
In theory, the National Security Agency came under the titular control of the Director of Central Intelligence. In fact, it was a law unto itself.
That's what traffic analysis is all about, Jack. You try to guess intentions by who's talking to whom.
Yes, sir, but when everybody's talking to everybody...
Yeah.
Anything else on alert? Their army. Voiska PVO. Ryan referred to the Soviet Air Defense Network.
Nope. Just the fleet. Subs, ships, and naval aviation.
Ryan stretched. That makes it sound like an exercise, sir. We'll want a little more data on what they're doing, though. Have you talked to Admiral Davenport?
That's the next step. Haven't had time. I've only been in long enough to shave myself and turn the coffee on.
Greer sat down and set his phone receiver in a desk speaker before punching in the numbers.
Rear Admiral Davenport.
The voice was curt.
Morning, Charlie. James here. Did you get that NSA 976?
Sure did, but that's not what got me up. Our SOSUS net went berserk a few hours ago.
Oh?
Greer looked at the phone, then at Ryan.
Yeah, nearly every sub they have at sea just put the pedal to the metal, and all at about the same time.
Doing what exactly, Charlie?
Greer prompted.
We're still figuring that out. It looks like a lot of boats are heading into the North Atlantic. Their units in the Norwegian Sea are racing southwest. 3 from the Western Med are heading that way too, but we haven't got a clear picture yet. We need a few more hours.
What do they have operating off our coast, sir? Ryan asked.
They woke you up, Ryan. Good. 2 old Novembers. One's a Raven conversion doing an ELINT job off the Cape. The other one's sitting off Kings Bay making a damn nuisance of itself.
Ryan smiled to himself. An American or Allied ship was a she, The Russians used the male pronoun for a ship, and the intelligence community usually referred to a Soviet ship as it.
There's a Yankee boat,
Davenport went on.
1,000 miles south of Iceland, and the initial report is that it's heading north. Probably wrong. Reciprocal bearing, transcription error, something like that. We're checking. Must be a goof, because it was heading south earlier.
Ryan looked up. What about their other missile boats?
Their Deltas and Typhoons are in the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, as usual. No news on them. Oh, we have attack boats up there, of course, but Gallery doesn't want them to break radio silence, and he's right. So all we have at the moment is the report on the stray Yankee.
What are we doing, Charlie?
Greer asked.
Gallery has a general alert out to his boats. They're standing by in case we need to redeploy. NORAD has gone to a slightly increased alert status, they tell me.
Davenport referred to the North American Aerospace Defense Command.
Sink Land and Sink Pack fleet staffs are up and running around in circles like you'd expect. Some extra P-3s are working out of Iceland. Nothing much else at the moment. First we have to figure out what they're up to.
Okay, keep me posted.
Roger, if we hear anything, I'll let you know. And I trust...
We will.
Greer killed the phone. He shook a finger at Ryan.
Don't you go to sleep on me, Jack.
On top of this stuff? Ryan waved his mug.
You're not concerned, I see.
Sir, there's nothing to be concerned about yet. It's what, 1 in the afternoon over there now? Probably some admiral, maybe old Sergei himself, decided to toss a drill at his boys. He wasn't supposed to be all that pleased with how Crimson Storm worked out, and maybe he decided to rattle a few cages, ours included, of course. Hell, their Army and Air Force aren't involved, and it's for damn sure that if they were planning anything nasty, the other services would know about it. We'll have to keep an eye on this, but so far I don't see anything to, Ryan almost said lose sleep over, sweat about.
How old were you at Pearl Harbor?
My father was 19, sir. He didn't marry until after the war, and I wasn't the first little Ryan. Jack smiled. Greer knew all this. As I recall, you weren't all that old yourself.
I was a seaman second on the old Texas.
Greer had never made it into that war. Soon after it started, he'd been accepted by the Naval Academy. By the time he had graduated from there and finished training at submarine school, the war was almost over. He reached the Japanese coast on his first cruise the day after the war ended.
But you know what I mean.
Indeed I do, sir. And that's why we have the CIA, DIA, NSA, and NRO, among others. If the Ruskies can fool all of us, maybe we ought to read up on our marks.
All those subs heading into the Atlantic.
I feel better with word that the Yankee is heading north. They've had enough time to make that a hard piece of data. Davenport probably doesn't want to believe it without confirmation. If Ivan was looking to play hardball, that Yankee'd be heading south. The missiles on those old boats can't reach very far, so we stay up and watch. Fortunately, sir, you make a decent cup of coffee.
How does breakfast grab you?
Might as well. If we can finish up on the Afghanistan stuff, maybe I can fly back tonight.
You still might. Maybe this way you'll learn to sleep on the plane.
Breakfast was sent up 20 minutes later. Both men were accustomed to big ones, and the food was surprisingly good. Ordinarily, CIA cafeteria food was government undistinguished, and Ryan wondered if the night crew, with fewer people to serve, might take the time to do their job right, or maybe they had sent out for it. The two men sat around until Davenport phoned at 6:45.
It's definite. All the boomers are heading towards port. We have good tracks on 2 Yankees, 3 Deltas, and a Typhoon. Memphis reported in when her Delta took off for home at 20 knots after being on station for 5 days. And then Gallery queried Queenfish. Same story. Looks like they're all headed for the barn. Also, we just got some photos from a Big Bird pass over the fjord. For once, it wasn't covered with clouds, and we have a bunch of surface ships with bright infrared signatures, like they're getting steam up.
How about Red October? Ryan asked.
Nothing. Maybe our information was bad and she didn't sail. Wouldn't be the first time.
You don't suppose they've lost her? Ryan wondered aloud. Davenport had already thought of that.
That would explain the activity up north. But what about the Baltic and Med business?
2 years ago we had that scare with Tullaby, Ryan pointed out. And the CNO was so pissed he threw an all-hands rescue drill on both oceans.
Maybe,
Davenport conceded. The blood in Norfolk was supposed to have been ankle-deep after that fiasco. The USS Tullaby, a small, one-of-a-kind attack sub, had long carried a reputation for bad luck. In this case, it had spilled over onto a lot of others. Anyway, it looks a whole lot less scary than it did 2 hours back. They wouldn't be recalling their boomers if they were planning anything against us, would they? Ryan said.
I see that Ryan still has your crystal ball, James.
That's what I paid him for, Charlie.
Still, it is odd, Ryan commented. Why recall all of the missile boats? Have they ever done this before? What about the ones in the Pacific?
Haven't heard about those yet,
Davenport replied.
I've asked SyncPack for data, but they haven't got back to me yet. On the other question, no, they've never recalled all their boomers at once, but they do occasionally reshuffle all their positions at once. That's probably what this is. I said they're heading towards port, not into it. We won't know that for a couple of days.
What if they're afraid they've lost one? Ryan ventured.
No such luck,
Davenport scoffed.
They haven't lost a boomer since that Gulf we lifted off Hawaii, back when you were in high school, Ryan. Remius is too good a skipper to let that happen.
So was Captain Smith of the Titanic, Ryan thought.
Thanks for the info, Charlie.
Greer hung up.
Looks like you were right, Jack. Nothing to worry about yet. Let's get that data on Afghanistan in here, and just for the hell of it, we'll look at Charlie's pictures of their northern fleet when we're finished.
10 minutes later, a messenger arrived with a cart from Central Files. Greer was the sort who liked to see the raw data himself. This suited Ryan. He'd known of a few analysts who had based their reports on selective data and been cut off at the knees for it by this man. The information on the cart was from a variety of sources, but to Ryan the most significant were tactical radio intercepts from listening posts on the Pakistani border, and, he gathered, from inside Afghanistan itself. The nature and tempo of Soviet operations did not indicate a backing off, as seemed to be suggested by a pair of recent articles in Red Star and some intelligence sources inside the Soviet Union. They spent 3 hours reviewing the data. I think Sir Basil is placing too much stock in political intelligence and too little in what our listening posts are getting in the field. It would not be unprecedented for the Soviets not to let their field commanders know what's going on in Moscow, of course. But on the whole, I do not see a clear picture, Ryan concluded. The Admiral looked at him.
I pay you for answers, Jack.
Sir, the truth is that Moscow moved in there by mistake. We know that from both military and political intelligence reports. The tenor of the data is pretty clear. From where I sit, I don't see that they know what they want to do. In a case like this, the bureaucratic mind finds it most easy to do nothing. So their field commanders are told to continue the mission, while the senior party bosses fumble around, looking for a solution and covering their asses for getting into the mess in the first place.
Okay, so we know that we don't know.
Yes, sir. I don't like it either, but saying anything else would be a lie. The Admiral snorted. There was a lot of that at Langley, intelligence types giving answers when they didn't even know the questions. Ryan was still new enough to the game that when he didn't know, he said so. Greer wondered if that would change in time. He hoped not. After lunch, a package arrived by messenger from the National Reconnaissance Office. It contained the photographs taken earlier in the day on 2 successive passes by a KH-11 satellite. They'd be the last such photos for a while because of the restrictions imposed by orbital mechanics and the generally miserable weather on the Kola Peninsula. The first set of visible light shots, taken an hour after the flash signal had gone out from Moscow, showed the fleet at anchor or tied to the docks. On infrared, a number of them were glowing brightly from internal heat, indicating that their boilers or gas turbine engine plants were operating. The second set of photos had been taken on the next orbital pass at a very low angle. Ryan scrutinized the blow-ups.
Wow! Kirov, Moskva, Kiev, 3 Karas, 5 Krestas, 4 Krivaks, 8 Udaloys, and 5 Sovramenyis. Search and rescue exercise, eh?
Greer gave Ryan a hard look.
Look at the bottom here. Every fast oiler they have is following them out. That's most of the striking force of the Northern Fleet right there. And if they need oilers, they figure to be out for a while.
Davenport could have been more specific, but we still have their boomers heading back in. No amphibious ships in this photo, just combatants. Only the new ones, too, the ones with range and speed.
And the best weapons.
Yeah, Ryan nodded, and all scrambled in a few hours. Sir, if they had this plan in advance, we'd have known about it. This must have been laid on today. Interesting.
You've picked up the English habit of understatement, Jack.
Greer stood up to stretch.
I want you to stay over an extra day."
"Okay, sir." He looked at his watch. "Mind if I phone the wife? I don't want her to drive out to the airport for a plane I'm not on."
"Sure. And after you finish that, I want you to go down and see someone in DIA who used to work for me. See how much operational data they're getting on this sortie. If this is a drill, we'll know soon enough, and you can still take your surfing Barbie home tomorrow."
It was a skiing Barbie, but Ryan didn't say so.